My name's Raymond, and if someone had told me a year ago that I'd be going through a divorce while mourning the loss of my mom, I would have laughed and said, "No way, not Michelle." But life has a funny way of exposing what's real and what's been fake all along. Before we get into the sweet part, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If you're watching us for the first time, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications so you never miss. I met Michelle nearly 9 years ago. We were both in our mid-20s chasing dreams and barely affording rent. She was smart, quick-witted, with this spark in her eye that made everything feel like an adventure. We clicked almost instantly. Back then, our problems were simple. Burnt dinners, late-night talks about the future, whether we could afford a trip to Vegas. I thought we were building something solid. That's where the real truth sits. The first red flag I ignored. My mom didn't quite warm up to Michelle now. My mom wasn't one to meddle. She was kind, patient, always the type to let me figure things out on my own. But after I introduced her to Michelle, she pulled me aside and said, "She's interesting. Just promise me you'll take your time." She wasn't angry. She wasn't rude. Just cautious. At the time, I thought she was being overly protective. I brushed it off and told myself she'd come around. Michelle and I dated for a few years. Before we got married, I thought the slow pace meant we were sure that we were ready, that we had a deep foundation. And honestly, for the first couple of years, things were okay. We had the usual bumps, arguments about money, messy schedules, but nothing dramatic. Just normal couple stuff. The relationship between my mom and Michelle, though, stayed the same. Polite but distant. No warm hugs, no girl chats over coffee. Just awkward smiles and tight small talk during holidays. I used to tell myself not. Everyone becomes best friends with their in-laws. And maybe that's true. But now, I realize my mom saw something I didn't. Something I didn't want to see. I had a decent job back then. Steady income, office cubicle, the whole 9 yards. But I wasn't happy. I wanted to do something on my own. Build something. So, 2 years into the marriage, I quit and started a small digital agency. Michelle supported the decision at first, at least on the surface. She said the right things. "I believe in you. You've got this." But over time, when the business didn't take off like a rocket, I could feel her patience thinning. And then came the blow that nearly wiped out everything. One of my team members botched a big client project. It wasn't just a small mistake, it was a full-on disaster. Within a week, our 2 biggest clients, who made up more than 50% of our revenue, pulled out. Just like that, the agency was spiraling. I tried everything. Networking events, cold emails, pitch after pitch, but nothing stuck. We were still running, but just barely. Bills started piling up. Groceries became tighter. I cut my own salary to keep the lights on, and Michelle, she wasn't exactly wearing the supportive spouse badge. She started snapping at every little thing. Left dishes piled in the sink. Rolled her eyes when I brought up client meetings. And when she did pitch in financially, it came with a heavy price. Hours of complaints and passive-aggressive comments. I don't blame her for being frustrated, but what hurt the most was how quickly she turned from teammate to critic. It felt like I had failed alone, even though we were supposed to be in this together. We weren't partners anymore. We were cohabitants, silent dinners, separate weekend plans, cold mornings. It was like living with a ghost who used to love me, but I kept pushing. I didn't want to ask my mom for help. I didn't want her to think she was right about Michelle. But after 2 months of bleeding money and losing sleep, I swallowed my pride and drove to her house. She didn't lecture me. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just listened then. Without a word, she pulled out a folder from her drawer. "Take this," she said. "It's not everything I have, but it's enough to get you back on your feet." That money saved my agency. I brought in a few consultants, polished our brand, landed a couple of mid-sized clients. It wasn't a miracle, but it was enough to breathe again, to sleep again. Funny thing though, the business recovered, but the marriage, DIDN, single quotes. Michelle and I were barely talking. Even with the stress off my shoulders, we didn't reconnect. No celebratory dinners. No, "I'm proud of you." Just more distance. And then life hit me harder. My mom called me one evening and asked if I could come over. Her voice was different, soft, but firm. When I arrived, she sat me down and said, "Raymond, I need to tell you something." She had been living with ovarian cancer for almost a year, late stage. The treatments weren't working anymore. The doctors told her it was time to start preparing for the end. I sat there, stunned. My mom was my anchor. She'd always been the strong one, the calm in every storm. And now, she was slipping away. The next few weeks were brutal. I spent every spare minute at the hospital. I tried to keep the agency afloat during the day, then rushed to her side every evening. I told Michelle everything. At first she said all the right things, but she barely showed up. Maybe 2 hospital visits, max. Work is crazy, she'd say. Or, hospitals drain me. And I get it, not everyone knows how to handle sickness. But I couldn't help noticing how checked out she was. Emotionally, she had already packed her bags. After 2 months, my mom passed away quietly, just like she had lived. No drama, no fuss. I buried her the next day, honoring her wish for a small private service. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. When I met with her lawyer a few days later, I expected to sign a few documents and move on. But instead, he slid a thick folder across the table and said, "Your mom set up a trust before she passed." I blinked. A what? A trust, he said. Everything she owned is in it. And it's all been left to you with conditions. I sat there, stunned. As he explained the rules, I couldn't access the money for 3 years. Not unless my life remained stable and, most importantly, if I got divorced during that period or even started the process, my spouse would get nothing. Zero. Zilch. That the trust was locked tighter than Fort Knox. My mom had structured it in a way that completely shielded it from divorce settlements. At first, I thought she was being paranoid. Then I remembered the way she looked at Michelle. All those years ago, like she saw something I didn't. Still, I didn't tell Michelle the full story. I just said there was an inheritance. I didn't mention the trust or the clauses. I wasn't trying to hide it. I just figured we had enough problems without adding legal jargon to the mix. But Michelle, she wasn't just listening. She was calculating. 2 weeks later, I was served with divorce papers. No fight, no conversation. Just a man in a cheap suit handing me an envelope and saying, "You've been served." Inside, a petition for divorce, irreconcilable differences. She thought she was walking away with half. She had no idea. The first time I sat across from Michelle after getting served, she didn't look nervous. If anything, she looked smug. I came home that evening, still in a daze, with the envelope in my hand. My mind was racing with questions, emotions, regrets, so much anger and disbelief, but I kept my cool. I walked into the kitchen where she was pouring herself a glass of wine, like it was just another Tuesday. "I got served today," I said flatly. She looked up, didn't even flinch. "Yeah," she said. "I figured you'd get it sometime this week." That was it. No explanation, no apology. "No. Can we talk about this?" I stood there waiting for her to say something else. Maybe some clue as to why she had made such a huge decision without warning. But she just leaned against the counter, glass in hand, completely at peace with the chaos she'd thrown into my life. So I asked her, why now? Why not talk to me first? She gave a little shrug, as if it wasn't that serious. "Raymond, we've been disconnected for a long time. We barely talk. We don't spend time together. This marriage has been over for a while. You just didn't want to admit it." I was floored. Yeah, things hadn't been great, but I never thought she'd just walk away like that. Especially not after everything I'd just gone through with my mom. What made it even worse? Her timing. 1 week after I buried my mother, while I was still processing the grief and trying to figure out what came next, Michelle had already met with her lawyer and filed for divorce. Like she'd been waiting for the right moment. When I was at my weakest to make her move. I couldn't sleep that night. I stared at the ceiling, thinking back to every sign I'd missed, every cold look, every shallow conversation we'd had over the past year. It all started making sense now, but I still had no idea what her real plan was. Not yet. A few days later, we had our first mediation session. Her lawyer came in confident, throwing around numbers and percentages like he already won the case before. It started he wanted 50% of everything, not just the house or our shared savings. He wanted a share of my business. And this is the kicker. He wanted a cut of all present and future financial gains, including my recent inheritance. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about us growing apart or falling out of love. Michelle didn't leave me because she was heartbroken. She left because she thought she hit the jackpot. She assumed I had instant access to my mother's fortune, and figured she'd take half on her way out. Her lawyer even made a smug little comment during mediation. "Michelle stood by you during tough times. She deserves to share in the success now that things are turning around." I almost laughed. She stood by me. She was barely even present. When I was drowning in debt and losing clients left and right, she never once encouraged me when I was fighting to rebuild my business. And when my mom was dying in the hospital, Michelle couldn't even show up for more than an hour at a time. But now that there was money involved, now she cared. I looked at my lawyer and he just gave me a nod. He had already prepared for this. We had brought the trust documents with us, and it was time to lay the cards on the table. During the next session, my lawyer calmly opened the folder and slid the papers across the table. "Before we proceed," he said, "you should be aware that Mr. Lawson's inheritance is not part of the marital estate." Michelle's lawyer raised an eyebrow. "How so?" My lawyer explained the structure of the trust, reading out loud the key clauses that protected the money, how it was untouchable for 3 years, how any divorce filed during that period would void spousal access to the funds completely, and then silence. I looked over at Michelle. That smug look was gone. Her mouth tightened. Her eyes darted over the documents like she was trying to find a loophole. Her lawyer looked uncomfortable, flipping through the pages hoping he'd missed something, but there was nothing. No wiggle room, no legal backdoor. That's when he said the words I'll never forget. We may need to reevaluate our position. Michelle's face fell. She had bet everything on that money. She thought the inheritance would be her golden parachute. She imagined walking away with $500,000, maybe more. Instead, she was walking into a storm with no umbrella. After that session, she barely looked at me. We didn't speak in the parking lot. We didn't speak at home. We just coexisted, silently waiting for the divorce to finalize, but behind her silence, I could feel the resentment growing. She started slamming doors, leaving dishes piled high, making snide comments under her breath. One night she even said, "Your mom did this on purpose. She never liked me." That part was probably true, but I didn't respond. There was no point arguing with someone who thought betrayal was a strategy. She started trying to backpedal a little after that, softening her tone, asking about my day, making tea and offering me some like we were suddenly civil. I wasn't stupid. I saw through it immediately. She thought maybe she could convince me to change the terms of the trust or delay the divorce long enough to outlast the 3-year clause, but I wasn't playing games anymore. The betrayal had sunk in deep. Not just the legal move, but the emotional one. The way she calculated her exit right in the middle of my grief. The way she weaponized our marriage like it was a contract with a payout clause. I'd loved this woman once. Fully, I believed in our future. I supported her dreams, encouraged her career, celebrated her wins. But when it was my turn to stumble, she didn't even try to catch me. She just reached for a calculator. The next few months were exhausting. We went through the motions, splitting furniture, dividing up what little savings we had, closing joint accounts. The only thing that made it bearable was knowing that the one thing she wanted most was the one thing she could never have. When the final paperwork came in, I signed it without hesitation. No tears, no dramatic farewell. Just closure. Michelle ended up with a small settlement. She fought for more, but her lawyer quietly admitted they didn't have a leg to stand on. The bulk of her payout was eaten up by her own legal fees. Poetic. In a way, a week after the divorce was finalized, she sent me a long text, something about how I had changed, how I used to be kind, and now I was cold. She said my mom had turned me into someone cruel. I didn't reply because she didn't get it. This wasn't about the money. It was about the betrayal. It was about watching someone I loved turn into a stranger the moment personal gain was on the table. It was about learning the hard way that love without loyalty is just a transaction waiting to fail. Michelle thought she had played the game perfectly, but she forgot who set the board. My mother wasn't a rich woman who flaunted her wealth. She lived modestly, gave quietly, and never said a word about her financial plans. But she saw something in Michelle from the very beginning, and she made sure that when the time came, her son wouldn't be left picking up the pieces alone. She protected me from beyond the grave. And now, for the first time in a long time, I could finally breathe. The house felt different after she left. Quieter, colder, but also strangely peaceful. For the first few days after the divorce was finalized, I found myself walking around like a guest in my own home, half expecting Michelle to come around the corner, say something passive-aggressive, or slam a cabinet just loud enough to make a point. But she was gone. And so was the tension that had been hanging in the air like fog for months. Still, the silence brought its own discomfort. I spent my first weekend alone, sitting on the edge of the couch, staring at the wall. No TV, no music. Just me, my thoughts, and the occasional hum of the fridge. I had fought so hard to keep everything together. My business, my marriage, my sanity, that when the dust settled, I didn't even know what I was supposed to feel. Relief, anger, sadness. Truth was, I felt all of it. And none of it I cleaned out. Her side of the closet, packed up her leftover things into boxes and taped them shut without even opening most of them. I didn't care what was inside. I just wanted them out of my space. Out of my head. She didn't even bother to collect them. Eventually, I sent them to her sister's place. A few friends reached out to ask how I was holding up. I gave them the usual line, "I'm okay, just taking it day by day." What I didn't say was that I felt like I was grieving 2 losses at once. My mother and my marriage, one taken by life, the other by betrayal. I started going into the office more, not because there was anything urgent to handle, but because being around people, even just the sound of keyboards and ringing phones, helped distract me. The business had stabilized since the crash, and the projects coming in now were decent. Nothing huge, but steady. I poured myself into the work, redesigned the website, updated branding, took on 2 interns. I even started hosting monthly coffee meets 4 local entrepreneurs just to stay connected with people who weren't part of the emotional chaos I'd just lived through. It helped. I started smiling again. Not the fake, tight-lipped smiles I'd been wearing for the past year, but real ones. I started sleeping through the night. I could breathe without feeling like there was a rock sitting on my chest. But healing doesn't happen in a straight line. About 2 months after the divorce, I got a message that stopped me cold. It was from Michelle. It was short, just 2 lines. "Hey, I know things didn't end well, but I could really use someone to talk to. Can we meet?" I stared at that text for at least 10 minutes. Part of me wanted to ignore it. The other part, curious, annoyed, a little angry maybe, but also wondering what she wanted now. I didn't reply immediately. I let it sit. The next day, she messaged, "Again, I'm sorry I didn't know who else to turn to. I'm in a really bad place, Raymond." Still, I didn't answer. Not yet. I needed to think this through. Michelle had walked away from me with a lawyer at her side, papers in hand and her eyes on a $sign. She hadn't asked how I was. She hadn't cared about my grief. She had waited until my mother was gone to make her move, so why now? What did she want from me? Eventually, I replied, keeping it short, "Hope you're okay." "What's going on?" That opened the floodgates. She poured it all out. She had moved into a rental apartment after the divorce, thinking it would be temporary. She assumed she'd get more from the settlement and hadn't planned for things to be tight. Her job had cut her hours. She was struggling to pay rent. Credit card debt was piling up. And worst of all, her lawyer was threatening to sue her for unpaid fees. She said she wasn't asking for money, just a friend, someone who remembered who she used to be. Someone who could understand. It was the most honest she had sounded in over a year. I agreed to meet her for coffee. Neutral ground, a public place. No expectations. When I walked in and saw her sitting there, it felt surreal. She looked smaller, somehow tired, like someone who'd aged 5 years in 5 months. Her eyes met mine and she gave a nervous smile. We didn't hug, just sat down. She started talking about the stress, about how everything had spiraled. She admitted that she filed for divorce too quickly, that she didn't realize how cold she had become, that maybe she had been chasing security instead of love. "I thought we were done, Raymond," she said quietly, "but I didn't think I'd be this empty." I nodded. I listened, but I didn't try to fix it. When she finally paused, I asked one question. "Do you regret it?" She looked down at her coffee cup, turning it slowly between her palms. "I regret hurting you." It didn't. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. But honesty doesn't erase damage. I thanked her for the talk, told her I hoped she'd find her footing again, but I made it clear there was no going back. We had crossed that bridge and it had burned on both ends. She nodded. Didn't argue, we parted ways, and just like that, the chapter closed. For good this time. After that, I focused on me. I started going to therapy, something I'd always brushed off. But talking to someone helped me process not just the betrayal, but the patterns I had ignored in myself. The way I gave too much without boundaries. The way I confused stability with love. I took a trip to the coast, just me and the ocean. Emails, no phone calls, just waves and silence. And somewhere in the middle of that solo weekend, I felt something shift, not an explosion, just a quiet peace. Like I had finally made it to the other side. I started writing again, nothing serious, just journaling. Reflections on grief, loss, and growth. And weirdly enough, it started resonating. I shared a few thoughts online and people started reaching out. Strangers, saying, "Hey, I'm going through something similar." That's when I realized, maybe this whole mess could help someone else. Maybe my story wasn't just about what I lost, but about what I learned. People always say heartbreak is the best teacher. I never understood that until I lived it. I learned that love without loyalty is just decoration. I learned that grief doesn't ask for your schedule, it just arrives. And I learned that sometimes, the people who hurt you the most are the ones who once claimed they'd never leave. But the most powerful lesson? You can survive it. You can come out of the storm, drenched and exhausted, and still rebuild. You can love again. Not just someone new, but yourself. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for me. Not for appearances, not for a fragile marriage, not for fear, just me and that. More than any trust fund or financial settlement was the real gift my mom left behind. She gave me the tools to protect myself, and in doing so, she reminded me that I deserved better, that I mattered, that my peace wasn't something to negotiate over. And now I'm just getting started. The days that followed that coffee meeting with Michelle were strange. Not painful, not dramatic, just weird. It was like watching the final scene of a movie I'd been stuck in for too long. The credits were rolling, the lights had come on, and I was just sitting there wondering what to do with myself. The version of my life I had been trying so hard to hold together was finally gone, and I wasn't sure what to replace it with. But that's the funny thing about freedom. At first, it can feel like loneliness in disguise. I had my business, sure. The agency was recovering well. My small team was starting to believe again, showing up with energy, pitching ideas, even joking in the break room. The laughter in the office wasn't forced anymore. And it wasn't lost on me that the more stable the business became, the less. Michelle tried to reach out, I guess once she realized there was no loophole to the trust. No backdoor to sneak through. She finally gave up, but I hadn't, not on myself. I was tired of feeling like life was something I was reacting to, not living. I'd spent so long on edge bracing for Michelle's mood swings, second-guessing every financial move, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Now that the noise had stopped, I had to decide what kind of life I actually wanted. I started small. Every Saturday I'd walk to the farmer's market near my apartment. I'd grab coffee, talk to local vendors, maybe buy something random like homemade jam or hand-carved spoons. I wasn't doing it for any reason other than it felt good to be out there, doing normal things again. It helped me remember that life didn't need to be a crisis to be meaningful. I reconnected with old friends too, people I'd unintentionally pushed away during the dark months. They welcomed me back without judgment, even though I probably deserved a few told-you-so-s. One night over drinks, my best friend Sam looked at me and said, "Man, you're finally looking like yourself. Again." And for once, I believed it. I even joined a gym, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I was tired of feeling like a passenger in my own body. The first few weeks were rough. Everything hurt, but slowly I felt stronger. Not just physically, but mentally. The act of showing up for myself every day, pushing through the discomfort, gave me a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. That's when I remembered something my mom used to say. Peace isn't found, it's built. And brick by brick, I was building it. One afternoon, I was sitting at my desk looking over some numbers when an idea struck me. Something I had shelved long ago. A podcast, back when I was still working my corporate job. I used to dream about starting a podcast for small business owners. Not one of those overproduced, jargon-filled shows, but something real. Something that told the raw stories behind entrepreneurship. The failures, the near misses, the I almost gave up moments. I had the gear. I had the stories. And now, I had the freedom, so I did it. Episode 1. How I Almost Lost Everything. I recorded it in my home office, sitting in front of a borrowed mic, speaking from the heart. I talked about the agency's near collapse. I didn't mention Michelle by name, but I hinted at the personal storms behind the scenes. I kept it raw, honest, vulnerable. I uploaded it and didn't expect much, but something strange happened. People listened. Not a huge crowd, not at first, but a few dozen, then a few hundred. Emails started coming in. Comments, messages on social media, people saying, "Thank you for being real," or "This made me feel less alone." I didn't realize how much I needed that to feel useful again, to turn my pain into something meaningful, and so I kept going. Week after week, I recorded more episodes. I invited guests, other business owners, creatives, even a therapist who specialized in burnout. The podcast became more than a project. It became therapy with an audience, and slowly, it became part of my healing. But there was one more thing I needed to do. Something I'd been avoiding for months. I needed to go back to my mom's house. After the funeral, I'd locked it up and left everything untouched. I told myself I'd get around to it, but deep down, I wasn't ready. The idea of walking through her home, with her scent still faintly lingering in the air, with her favorite mug still on the shelf, was too much. But now, I felt ready. I drove. Out there on a Sunday morning, the neighborhood looked exactly the same. Kids riding bikes, a dog barking somewhere, someone mowing their lawn. But her house? It looked frozen in time. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and took a deep breath. The silence was thick. I walked from room to room, touching things gently as if she might come back and scold me for leaving fingerprints. Her plants were still there, alive somehow. A neighbor had been watering them in her bedroom. I found a box labeled simply, "For Raymond." It nearly broke me. Inside were letters, photos, a tiny journal with notes she had written over the years. Thoughts, memories, advice. I sat on the edge of her bed and read every page. She wrote about her hopes for me, her fears, and yes, even her suspicions about Michelle, but she never once wrote with bitterness, only love. That night I didn't sleep much. I stayed at the house, curled up on the old couch, surrounded by memories. But it wasn't as painful as I feared. It was like saying a final goodbye, not rushed, not tear-soaked, just peaceful. The next morning, I called a real estate agent. It was time to let go, not out of pain, but gratitude. Selling the house wasn't about moving on from my mother. It was about honoring her wishes. She had set up the trust to protect me, not imprison me in grief, and I finally understood that. With the sale in motion, I used part of the proceeds to fund a mentorship program through my business. I created a grant for young entrepreneurs who couldn't afford to launch their dreams. I named it after her, the Clara Foundation. That's when I started to feel full again, not because I had money, not because Michelle was gone, but because I was living with purpose. The storm had passed, and while the scars were still there, I wasn't ashamed of them. They told a story of survival, resilience, and rediscovery. And I knew I wasn't done writing it yet. Life doesn't wrap things up in perfect endings. It's not a movie with dramatic music and a closing shot. Sometimes, it just keeps going, quietly, uneventfully. And that's exactly what started happening to me. For the first time in a long while, things were calm. Not just on the outside. My business was stable, my schedule manageable, my phone no longer ringing with chaos, but on the inside too. My thoughts weren't racing anymore. I didn't wake up dreading the day or bracing for another emotional blow. I just woke up peacefully. There's something powerful about ordinary mornings, making coffee without rushing, watching the sunlight hit your kitchen counter, hearing birds outside your window. Those small, boring things started to feel like treasure to me, because after everything I went through, the loss, the betrayal, the unraveling, I finally had space to breathe. The podcast took off in ways I didn't expect. I started getting invited to speak on panels at small business events, even universities. People didn't just see me as a business owner anymore. They saw me as someone who had been through fire and lived to tell the tale. It was strange at first. To be asked questions like, how did you bounce back from that? Or what advice would you give to someone going through betrayal? I didn't have perfect answers. I just spoke from the gut. I told them healing isn't a straight line, that some nights you'll feel okay and others you'll stare at the ceiling feeling broken again. I told them there's no shame in asking for help. That letting go doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're wise enough to stop holding poison in your hands. The more I shared, the more I realized maybe this pain wasn't wasted. Maybe this whole chapter of my life wasn't just some cruel detour. Maybe it was the exact mess I needed to get here one day. I got an email. It was short, just a few lines. Hey Raymond, I don't expect a reply, but I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. Hope you're doing okay. Michelle. I stared at it for a long time. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I didn't feel anything. No anger, no heartbreak, no urge to relive the past. Just nothing. And in a weird way, that was the most peaceful feeling I'd had in years. It meant I had truly let go. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to be cold, but because some doors are better left closed. You don't need to slam them or lock them, you just walk away from them quietly and keep moving forward. Later that week, I visited my mom's grave. I brought her favorite flowers, blue irises, and sat down in the grass beside her. I told her everything, about how the business was finally in a good place, about the podcast, about the foundation. I started in her name. I even told her about Michelle's message. I smiled when I said it, because I knew if my mom were alive, she would have rolled her eyes and said, "Some people only learn the hard way." Then we would have both laughed. Sitting there, I felt something settle in my chest. Closure, maybe. Not the kind you chase through answers or apologies, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes when you realize you survived what you thought would destroy you, and you're better because of it. A few months later, something unexpected happened. I met someone. It wasn't planned. I wasn't looking. But that's the thing about good things. They show up when you've stopped begging for them. Her name was Alina. She was a graphic designer I hired for a podcast rebrand. We started off exchanging emails and feedback on colors and fonts. But then, somehow, we ended up talking about music, favorite books, and late-night cravings for tacos. It was easy, comfortable. There was no performance, no pressure to impress. Just two people, slowly getting to know each other with no or expectations. The first time we met in person, it wasn't even a date. We grabbed coffee after a client meeting, and before I knew it, 2 hours had passed. We talked about grief, childhood, dreams, failure. She didn't flinch when I told her about my divorce. She just nodded and said, "Sounds like you've done a lot of growing," and that was it. No judgment, no pity. Just understanding we didn't rush anything. We took our time, dinners, walks, laughter, quiet weekends. I learned what it felt like to be seen without being dissected. to be heard without being corrected. With Alina, everything felt lighter. And more importantly, I felt like myself again. One night, as we sat on my balcony sipping wine, she asked me something simple. "What's one thing you're proud of?" I paused, because it wasn't the podcast or the business. It wasn't surviving the divorce or rebuilding from scratch. It was this, I said, smiling. Right now, sitting here and not being angry anymore. That moment stuck with me, because when you've lived through betrayal, you think healing will feel like revenge, like proving something, like showing up in a luxury car and waving goodbye to your past. But healing is quiet. It looks like peace. It looks like sleeping well, laughing easily, answering unknown numbers without fear, looking at old pictures and not feeling like they belong. To a stranger, it looks like moving on, not because you want to hurt anyone, but because you finally love yourself enough to leave what broke you behind. So that's where I am now. Not perfect, not healed in the way Instagram quotes describe, but whole, in a way I didn't think was possible a year ago. I've learned that sometimes the people who hurt you aren't villains. They're just broken in ways you can't fix. And your job isn't to glue them together. It's to stop cutting yourself on their sharp edges. Michelle taught me that. So did the silence, so did grief, and so did my mom. I carry her with me now, not just in memory, but in the way I live, the way I listen, the way I love. Her legacy isn't just a trust fund or a foundation. It's in every decision I make that puts peace above pride, healing above holding on. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe Alina and I go the distance. Maybe we don't. Maybe the podcast becomes something big. Maybe it stays niche and cozy. But for once, I'm not living in the what ifs. I'm here, living life to the fullest. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more of these stories.